They don't have the eyes to see the needs of their fellow neighbors. They don't have the eyes to see the plight of the poor and the downtrodden and the outcast. It's like they have blinders on. They have tunnel vision to where they only see what they want to see. Hey Christians, Daniel here. Let's talk about blindness. So if you've been following along with this series of videos that we're doing, we've been looking at Luke chapter 4. In Luke 4, Jesus goes to his hometown of Nazareth, and he goes to the synagogue on Sabbath day. They hand him a scroll, he reads from Isaiah 61, and then he says, "This has been fulfilled in your hearing." So we've been looking at that passage that he reads from. We've been seeing how it plays out throughout his ministry and what those things mean for us today as Christians. So we've already looked at proclaiming good news to the poor. We've already looked at proclaiming freedom for the prisoners. Today we're going to the next line that he reads, where he says he came to restore sight for the blind, or recovery of sight for the blind. What? As far as I can tell, throughout the Bible, so far, nobody has actually had their sight restored. I don't think that's a thing that happens in the Hebrew Scriptures. I don't think that there's a time in the Old Testament where someone was blind and they were miraculously healed and recovered their sight in some way. I don't think that happened. If I'm wrong, let me know in the comments, because I couldn't find it. So then Jesus comes along and reads this from Isaiah 61, and recovery of sight for the blind is part of his mission. Nobody's ever seen that happen. And yet, it happens maybe half a dozen times during Jesus' ministry. I mean, all of these references right here are stories in the Gospels about Jesus healing a blind person. You've got like the blind beggars who come to him. You've got people who are demon-possessed and can't see because of that. You've got people who follow Jesus and cry out, "Save me, have mercy on me." You've got a guy that Jesus says straight up, "Do you want to be made well?" In John chapter 9, the disciples see this guy who was born blind, and they ask him, who sinned, this guy or his parents, that he's blind? Because they have that mentality. Blindness was not something that you would recover from back in those days. In fact, I kind of have a personal connection with this. Not that I'm blind per se, but I am incredibly nearsighted. I've had to wear glasses since I was in 2nd grade. You wouldn't know by looking at me because I wear contacts most of the time, but my glasses are super thick. I'm very nearsighted. If I had been born in Jesus' day, I would have been resigned to very menial tasks. Maybe, writing, I could probably do that, but I couldn't be a hunter, that's for sure. I wouldn't have the eyesight for that. I wouldn't be able to be on a ship navigating the seas. I wouldn't be able to do a lot of exploration or travel. I wouldn't make a good merchant because I couldn't see what I'm buying. A lot of these things would be closed off for me because my eyesight would be so bad. So I'm very thankful for the modern technologies that we have with glasses, with contact lenses. I hope to someday maybe even get LASIK surgery so I can just wake up and see in the mornings without having to put my glasses on. So for Jesus to restore sight for the blind was a big deal. And it would be a big deal even to this day. You've probably seen videos, I love these kind of videos, where people who are colorblind, for instance, put on those special glasses and now they can see all the colors around that they've missed their entire lives. I love those videos. It's amazing what modern medicine has been able to do for us as a human species over the last few decades, especially. But I also think when Jesus said he came to restore sight for the blind, I don't think that was limited. Obviously, Jesus did more than just heal blind people. I mean, as amazing as those stories are, he did so much more for a lot of other people. He cured leprosy, he made the lame to walk again, he even raised some people from the dead. He did so many miracles and so many healings that I think when he says that from Isaiah 61, to restore sight for the blind, I think he includes a lot of other healings as well. And here's why I can say that. Because just flipping another page or two, you come to Luke chapter 7. And in Luke chapter 7, John the Baptist, who's already been arrested, sends a couple of his disciples as messengers to Jesus to ask him a question. Are you the Messiah, or should we wait for somebody else? This is Jesus' response. He says, go back and report to John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive sight. So there it is, Isaiah 61. But he goes on. The lame walk. Those who have leprosy are cleansed. The deaf hear. The dead are raised. And the good news is proclaimed to the poor. There's Isaiah 61 again. Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me. So that's Jesus' mission in a nutshell as far as proof that he is who he says he is. Anyone could just go around saying that they've been anointed with the Spirit, but Jesus proves it by carrying out the mission of Isaiah 61. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. How do we know? Because the poor hear the good news, the blind have received sight, and by the way, that means healing and restoration for all these other people too. Now, I don't know if you're aware, but the earliest Christians did seem to take Jesus' message seriously. He says in John chapter 14, this is kind of his farewell speech to his apostles. He says in John chapter 14, verse 12, that they are going to do even greater things than these. Well, what are these? All the signs and the miracles that they've seen Jesus do. He tells his disciples, you're going to do even greater things than these because I'm going to the Father. So what does that mean? Well, we see that play out throughout the book of Acts especially, where guys like Peter and Paul and a few others are able to perform miraculous healings. That's for sure. We see those stories happen. They kind of continue on this idea of miraculous healing as a sign of God's power and the assurance of the kingdom of God. But at some point, those somewhat widespread miraculous healings did seem to phase out. So what do you do then? Well, you still take care of each other. There's evidence as far as about the mid-2nd century, so like early 100s to 150, that the church had already come together as a community to provide for each other's medical needs and ailments. And even just a little bit further than that, in the year 250 to 251, there was a massive plague that struck the city of Rome. And so many people fled the city, but the Christians stayed. The Christians stayed and took care of the plague victims and the widows and the orphans. And it's estimated that the Christians, over the course of those couple years in Rome, spent anywhere between $15 to $30 million in today's currency to provide for the medical needs and care of all those affected by this plague. They were on the front lines, tending to those in need. The very first hospitals as we know them today would be founded a little bit later, so around 360 AD, the first kind of public hospital in any sort of official capacity was formed in Caesarea of Cappadocia by Christians. They kind of showed Rome how it could be done. Rome and Greece up to that point had like temple complexes where you could go. They had little hospitals that would give medical treatment to like slaves of the nobility. They would gladiators, soldiers. There were some things like that. There were basically military hospitals, but they were not open to the public. That wouldn't happen until the Christians came along because they took Jesus' message seriously, that you will do greater things than these. And so they opened the first hospitals, and they opened it up to everybody, not just those who could afford, but especially to those who couldn't afford the necessary medical treatments elsewhere. So to the poor, to the widows, to the orphans, to the foreigners, that's who they treated. And it changed the medical world. So what does that mean for us today? I think we as Christians should support any measure that allows access to health care for as many people as possible. I'm not getting into a debate as to whether that's single payer, kind of socialist health care, or whether that's privatized insurance. I really don't care. As long as Everybody that needs a procedure can get the procedure, can get the medical care that they need, and not have to go bankrupt for it, and not have to put their life savings on the line, and not have to sell their house and become basically homeless because they get cancer. That's not right. The first Christians didn't take care of people for the money. They didn't swindle people out of their money. Jesus never charged for a miraculous healing. They wanted to provide as much healing and restoration to the community as they could. And they didn't take financial advantage of people. So I'm all for any measure that is going to bring affordable health care to as many people as possible. And I think that should be something we care about. But I also want to take this from a slightly different perspective too. Because when Jesus says he came to restore sight for the blind, there's another type of blindness that we see in the gospel. It's not a physical blindness, it's a spiritual blindness. In fact, you can see in all of these passages right here that Jesus talks about spiritual blindness. He talks about how the Pharisees think they can see, but they are really blind. They're blind to the things of God. They're blind to what's really going on. They do not have the eyes to see the kingdom of God breaking in right around them. They don't have the eyes to see the needs of their fellow neighbors. They don't have the eyes to see the plight of the poor and the downtrodden and the outcast. It's like they have blinders on. They have tunnel vision to where they only see what they want to see. One of my favorite verses in all of this is from John chapter 9, the healing of the blind man. And this whole investigation ensues because they just want to catch Jesus somehow. And the healing happens on the Sabbath. And so they bring in this formerly blind man. And he says, I don't know who this guy was. I don't know whether he's a sinner or not. I don't know anything about him. All I know is that I was blind, but now I see. I was blind, but now I see. He's talking from a very physical reality for himself. But these Pharisees, they finally get Jesus and they question him, and Jesus turns the tables on them and says, you think you can see, but you're just as blind as ever. And it makes me think of that song, Amazing Grace, that has that line, I once was blind, but now I see. And I can't help but think of the man who wrote that song, John Newton, who was a British sailor and slave trader. He was the captain of slave ships, bringing African slaves back to England. And he had kind of a conversion experience when he was caught in a storm. He had one of those panic moments. So if I die, I'm going to hell for sure. So he kind of got his life right and made some commitments to God and kind of had this conversion experience and became more serious about the gospel and more serious about his faith. And he wrote this song, Amazing Grace, reflecting back on some of those experiences. However, he wrote that song while he was still the captain of these slave vessels. Sometimes the process of restoring our sight takes some time. Several years later, John Newton would become an abolitionist. He would come out of the slave trading business, he would become an ordained minister, and then he would start to actually advocate for the abolition of slavery. But it took some time. So this idea of I once was blind, but now I see, that process can take time. Even if our eyes are open to the reality around us, to our own sin, or to the brokenness of the world, or to systems of evil that control things behind the scenes that we may not pay attention to. Once our eyes are open to those things, it can really take time for real, lasting change to occur. But I think it's worth it. I think it's a process we need to go through. We don't know our own blind spots. That's why it's as important as ever to get as close to Jesus as we can, because the closer we get to Jesus, the more clear everything else around us becomes. And the more our sight will be restored. Hey Christians, let's talk again soon.